Thank you all for having me, and thank you, Fred. To say I'm here to separate the Siegel. So. I wanted to start with something of an overview of New York state and city government. And I would just say that the big picture is not a pretty one. I think that New York state and city has some of the worst government in America. You can measure a number of ways. There's corruption cases, to the tax burden, to Medicaid and education costs per capita, the highest in the country. A few years ago, for example, there was a well-known measurement that New York's Medicaid costs were higher than Texas and California combined. So roughly 60 million people versus 20 million people, and we were spending more. I don't think anyone would argue we have better outcomes. Slow job growth, poor education results, again, for the highest cost in the nation. Okay. You add all these things together, and it really makes the state and the city look like a mess. And then you take the little things that we all endure every day. The rutted streets, the noise, the litter, the traffic. And I ask myself continually, and a lot of what I write about is based on this question: how do they get away with it? How does any government get away with such poor service for so long? And people don't even talk about it anymore. It's rarely brought up. It's just assumed that this is the price of living in New York. Fred has often talked and written about, along with Joel Kotkin, about a barbell society, where the very rich and the very poor, and not much in the middle. And I think that is one of the results of bad government. I think there are three features that combine to produce these results that we have. First, I would say, is low voter turnout. In the 2014 gubernatorial race, Andrew Cuomo versus Rob Astorino, 3.7 million people voted. It was the lowest total in modern records. Only about 33% of the people voted. The first time ever, in modern times, that there were fewer than 4 million votes cast. Very few legislative seats are competitive. Out of 213, perhaps 15 to 20 in a given year are really competitive. It has been said that an incumbent in Albany has a better chance of going to jail than being defeated in a general election. The same is true of turnout in the city. In the mayoral election in 2013, turnout was just 24%, a little over 1 million votes cast. In 1993, for example, David Dinkins versus Rudy Giuliani, almost 2 million votes cast. In the recent Democratic primary in the city, in September, only 14% of Democrats voted. Well, think about that. 86% of registered Democrats stayed home on election day. The second of the three features I would mention is the increasingly gravitation toward a single party in both the city and the state. There's been no Republican statewide winner since George Pataki was reelected governor in 2002. No senators, no controller, no attorney general. Only through gerrymandering and the creation of 2 new seats have Republicans been able to be competitive in the legislature and hold on to some semblance of power in the state Senate. In the Assembly, Democrats now hold 107 out of 150 seats, a veto-proof majority. But the problem is even larger than that would suggest, because there are whole areas of the state that are completely dominated by one party or the other. By my count, and I think this might be the most amazing statistic of all, 70 legislative races were uncontested last year. 70, where the other party didn't even put up a candidate. This is both Republicans and Democrats. In Republican areas, just no Democrat runs. In Democratic areas, same, no Republicans. So 70 out of 213, 33%, where there was only one candidate on the ballot. That's not a healthy democracy. And in the city, of course, Republicans are approaching dinosaur status. Registration is 7-1 Democrat, 7-1. There are more people unaffiliated in the city with either party or any party than are registered Republicans. Now, although Rudy Giuliani and Michael Bloomberg won 5 consecutive terms as mayors largely as Republicans, although Bloomberg kind of fudged it in the third term, they did it through attracting independent and Democratic votes because there's simply not enough Republicans to elect a dog catcher citywide. The third and final element that I would focus on is corruption. And in my mind, corruption is a clear consequence of the first two problems: low voter turnout and single-party rule. Our government system, the American system writ large, is based on checks and balances. But in reality, that system depends on a two-party arrangement. That one party, the out party, will always be the loyal opposition, will be a check and balance on the party in power. But without that, the party in power has almost unlimited power. Not only to make the laws, but to set the public agenda and control the debate. Absent a countervailing force, you have a Democratic legislators write the laws, a Democratic governor signs them, and Democratic judges say, fine, whatever you like. Because, of course, the legislators and the governor pick the judges. So there's no countervailing force. There's nobody to say, hey, wait a minute, let's look at this. There's no argument. It's like a family feud, but it's not really a healthy argument about democratic principles, about different ways of looking at problems and solving them. So it's no coincidence that we have seen a raft of corruption cases. Think of this, both the governor and the mayor were investigated by federal officials at the same time. Now, neither was indicted, but cronies of the governor face trial next year, which should make his re-election campaign more interesting. And of course, Sheldon Silver and Dean Skelos, the top Democrat, the top Republican in the legislature, both convicted of corruption, official corruption. Now, those cases were overturned by appeals judges, and the refusal to bring charges against DiBlasio for his blatant pay-to-play scheme is worrisome. It says to me that prosecutors are gun-shy because of the Supreme Court ruling on the McDonnell case, which made it more difficult, though I think unreasonably more difficult, to prove corruption. Essentially, it said that cases where the officials do mundane things like have a meeting or call a hearing or even give a press conference, even though the person who benefits from that maybe is essentially bribing the public official, that does not constitute a quid pro quo. And therefore, although the government official may have benefited, it's very difficult to prove that the government actions were in exchange for the benefit, and therefore very difficult to convict them. And I think this does not bode well for New York. I think we may have fewer corruption cases, but more corruption. And because more Pauls will follow the wisdom of Plunkett of Tammany, who I'm sure Fred has told you all about, who favored what he called legal graft and declared that I seen my opportunities and I took them. That's the kind of government we have now, and I would argue that's the kind of government we deserve. So on that happy thought.
So, New York's not in very good shape, either the city or the state, and there's no crisis right now. So all this is Chicken Little and Chicken Little and Chicken Little right up until the sky falls, and it's not. So DiBlasio is coasting to re-election. Both him and Governor Cuomo are thinking seriously, they think, about running for president in 2020. And each of them is trying to point to the other as what's wrong with the Democratic Party, in a very interesting narcissism of fairly small differences. Cuomo has to run New York State, and because of gerrymandering, previously actually where prisoners from New York get sent and how they're counted as population and some other stuff, and weird breakaway Democrats and side deals only in the state Senate, we still have some sort of semblance of two-party rule. And DiBlasio's dream is that that's going to go away, and New York's going to be California, and we're going to be a progressive paradise of one sort or another. It's hard in New York, where there are very few city competitive elections, to take our government seriously. I've spent a lot of time with the people on our city council, and most of them are very unimpressive. I was struck earlier this year when they had a die-in and these other protest acts, and were indicating where they were on big reform issues that are of great importance, but they were going to fight the powers. Wait a minute, you are the power. And walking out of your own legislative body in protest is to me in many ways ridiculous. And this is actually happening while the speaker, Melissa Mark Viverito, we're going to talk a little bit more about, has been bottling up their more aggressive and progressive, if you like, political reforms, things like the Right to Know Act, and effectively protecting the body from itself and its own instincts and the political consequences of them in this really interesting way. And that's going to be harder and harder to keep doing as term limits mean, and we had a weird bump because of Bloomberg, that you have 4-year speakers. And so they don't have all that long to wield power for. And it's very easy for members to start looking past them pretty early in. With corruption, it's interesting because DiBlasio has a real case for honest graft in a way that is harder to make for Cuomo, who's going to have 2 separate trials of his associates as he's running for re-election, personally pocketing money. DiBlasio, interestingly enough, has been involved in all sorts of corrupt deals that prosecutors saw as corrupt and did very public scoldings of in a way that has an interesting parallel to Comey and Hillary Clinton. Like, it's not a crime, but bad, 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 which is not something prosecutors generally like to do. In the case of our public corruption, this does go back to McDonald, and this fascinating case where the Virginia governor and his wife are both getting bribed and then being tried for their bribes and separately saying those bribes are matters of personal friendship in some sense, and there's no official act. And the Supreme Court very ridiculously buys this argument. They narrow official acts so that if I say, if Executive Siegel says to my, calls up, or Senator Siegel calls up another senator and says, hey, you really need to give this thing that my friend, the doctor, would like a serious look right now, that's not corruption. If you do favors for friends who give you very expensive gifts, and fly you say to the DR, and you help their very young girlfriends get visas, that's not corruption. And so you have these acts of blatant corruption in New York that are nothing new, but Shelley Silver had a complicated and subtle scheme you needed subpoenas to see. Dean Skelos has a blockhead son who's on wiretap saying, we can't fucking talk about this, Breed is listening. Hey, you need to do this thing, and then my dad's going to help you out and give me this job, and then, excuse me, I got to go buy my wife a puppy while I go into the city to sleep with another woman. That's not corruption. Now, that's what's been overturned in these jury instructions. And what's fascinating is all these guys thought, hey, maybe we were doing corruption, DiBlasio included. His whole defense was, I talked to my lawyers. And the lawyers are very important because after he wins this crowded primary in 2013, There is no political accountability minus a crisis. And things that look like they could become crises about police reform, about police anger at the mayor, about our precarious budget, and unless those collapse, and they have not on his watch, to his real credit, there is no real political accountability there on his left or his right. And the people who could offer it within the party have been utterly incoherent. So there was just a big protest by actual Linskians, the members of Metro IAF through East Brooklyn congregations for this very ambitious housing plan for farther out of New York that would be incredibly expensive and I think is honorable and meritorious. And DiBlasio actually controls the budget, says he doesn't want that. And then all the people who didn't run for mayor as Democrats and thought about running to his left are suddenly light years to his left and saying, we've got to do something about markets and bankers and rich people right now, and we're out here with you, having just had the chance to actually push that agenda if they meant it. So we're in this state of hibernation, and some of this is good. Like, look, we have record turnout in 1993, which just exceeds the record turnout in 1989, because there's this sense of a city in imminent crisis. There's a racial crisis, a policing crisis, an economic crisis. It's all happening at once. So it's healthy for people to participate, but the high water mark is generally, oh God, we are in real trouble. And you want to have some middle in which you have interesting and competitive elections. And by the way, in 2009, in 2013, we had a interesting and competitive and weird Democratic primary. And Bill de Blasio clears 40%, which is the threshold to not have a runoff. And that was a good and useful exercise. It was a kludgy one for a lot of reasons, because this other guy, John Liu, was doing some other sorts of corruption involving phony donors, so you get matching funds. And we have a system that begs for that, right? Like, hey, my dollar is worth $5, but I can only give so many dollars. Let me find other people to give some of those dollars and turn them into $5, right? So he does that, and the campaign finance board, the authorities who are supposed to be over this can't really investigate because there's not enough time. This is really complicated because it's largely involving different parts of Chinese Americans who are doing this in other languages. So they just say you don't get any matching funds at all. So that proofs the other guy who's supposed to be competing in this accountable democratic way for the left wing of the field. There's pent-up disgust with Bloomberg, in large part for suppressing democracy and encouraging people not to participate in our system that greatly damages Quinn, plus a lot of dark money, and very corrupt dark money from de Blasio that she doesn't see coming, because he's the first guy in the new system of rules to pull this trick.
Who's Quinn, Harry?
She was the speaker and presumed to be the heir to Bloomberg and the next mayor on our continuity pad. But I don't want to bounce around too much. What I want to say is we have not had a progressive Democratic mayor except for 8 of the last 40 years in this one-party town. So there are here some real and implicit balances. We had one term of Dinkins, and this is in a lot of ways a fascinating accident. Giuliani wants to run against Koch, and sort of accidentally ends up running against Dinkins and has to reinvent his political character on the fly. And he does it in an incredibly clumsy fashion and falls just short. 4 years later, basically, he's a much better candidate. No one in the city has changed their mind about anything. All the same people come out to vote. There are a few new Asian American voters who vote for Giuliani, and there's Staten Island secession on the ballot. And Staten Island, is not like the rest of New York. And that tips just enough votes with no one else in the city changing their mind to shift its direction. We have 4 years of Dinkins, who inherits a profound mess from Koch that really is economically especially worse than people think at the time. And now 4 years of de Blasio. The difference is Dinkins inherits a city and tries to shift governance. Effectively, the main thing being, I want to find ways, as there's less and less federal money and as the economics are worse and worse, to give more to poor people. And this doesn't go well. De Blasio wants to do very much the same thing, but he's coming in at a moment when the city is doing reasonably well. And so strikingly, this guy this is a tale of two cities, is reasonably successful because he inherits a functional city and he's not messing with it too much except at the margins. And this includes in policing, by the way, where he says, I stop and frisk. And his campaign of politics has something to do with this, but there'd been this judge's decision previously. And Bloomberg and Ray Kelly had overplayed their hand significantly because they had little democratic accountability, especially on policing, for 12 years. And that's too long to go in one direction. So at a certain point, the answer is more is always better. And the people who complain aren't going to knock me out of office, and I'm standing by this police commissioner. So it's always more stops. This is always healthy. There's always, if you do enough stops, you're going to find someone with a gun or someone who's utterly appalling in character, and you point to that person. And look, finally the result is we have this thing that is advertised, and the politics are, we're having a giant course correction. And in fact, the continuity is striking. The Gini coefficient, to measure inequality, has not really moved. We're actually on a sequence with policing and reform that goes back about 6 years into the last years of the previous administration. And we have a politics in which people can basically do what they want, and we're more or less forced to trust them because there are not systems or measures of accountability. It's a great sin of Giuliani and Bloomberg as supposed reformers that neither of them build any sort of political system, whether you like their reforms or not, that outlasts them and creates that sort of accountability. So instead, we're going to have fairly calm democratic rule, a little corruption in New York, and a lot more in Albany, which is like a sad, lonely place, and upstate is decimated. And you have these legislators who have their per diems and sleep with their staffs and do small petty corruption and like to have better offices, and no one knows what any given legislator wants. It's all the will of the caucus, and the person who runs the caucus inevitably ends up going on trial, getting convicted, and then having it overturned, going back to Bruno too, right? And that's the sleepwalking system we have and that we're going to continue to have. And it's very unfortunate to me that neither the hard left, which has attempted to do this through the Working Families Party and previously Acorn, the centrists, or Republicans have built any sort of serious or sustaining political structure. So what we have is a system in which semi-ambitious people who want to have chauffeurs and little staffs and like some sense of power and being in the mix can do whatever they want as long as it's not all that consequential, and like maybe they'll get wiretapped and have charges. It's less likely now, and this is good enough, and it'll keep being good enough right up until it isn't. And my fear is that my friends at places like the Post, as they say, the city's going to hell, and look, you know crime's about to go up because there's a peeing person there and a passed out junkie there. There's a fentanyl, they're not doing the nod anymore, they are passed out. These warnings that are ahead of what's actually happening, and in a lot of ways it's meritorious not to arrest or get rid of every one of those people if crime isn't going up, and this isn't leading to an increase in murders and violent incidents, and to warn about the budget and what's going to happen. But it is, for the time being, business as usual, are making it harder to break through and sound the warning about the real and significant problems that I think are coming up for New York. But I'll leave it there, and I'm sure there's plenty to discuss.
What I'd like to do is let Michael and Harry talk to each other for a few minutes, and then we'll throw it open to you to ask any questions. Just one request. Ask a question, don't make a speech.
Enough of that. Harry, I thought you said a lot of interesting things there. I'd like to focus on your final point, though, the idea of an enduring political system, I guess, is the word. I think that's probably asking too much. I mean, I think it's the nature of change that, especially now, I mean, the Pope in one of his, I think his environmental encyclical used a word I'd never heard before, but I like it. It is rapidification. The speed of change is increasing, and I think that's true in politics too. I mean, Donald Trump is clear evidence of how quickly things change in a way that we could not anticipate. And so I think even just looking back at a mayoralty, for example, stop and frisk, although I supported it, I think it really did make a difference. It was obviously time to do it somewhat differently. And I think that has worked. But I think if you had tried to do in 2000 what DiBlasio did in 2014, it might have had a very different result. And so I think the continual change is something that we have to appreciate as building on the past, that we can change because of what we've accomplished, not in spite of it. That would be my general thought.
So we came very close to testing that out, and it actually takes us to Harvey Weinstein via Ken Sunshine, right? Mark Green was very likely to become mayor in 2001. He wanted to bring in Bill Braden. Bill Braden wanted to do very much what he ended up doing under DiBlasio. Would have stayed for longer at that point too, because he was younger, had more time to make money in the private sector eventually, right? Braden wanted to be the guy, and he's had this long rivalry with Kelly, going back to when Kelly was, I think it's police commissioner. Wanted to be the guy who said, look, at that point, this has gone too far, and we can undo some of the system. We've gotten obsessed with what we're measuring, which actually tracks the school debate in these really interesting ways. And it no longer relates to the underlying outcome of like a safer and more stable city. This is in 2000. So we came very close to having that premise tested. I think what I'm asking for is very excessive. We're in a period of tremendously rapid change, and smart people like DiBlasio, who's arrogant and pompous and ends up looking like a jerk a lot, in part because he's smart, right? Before Trump runs for president, he gets some of this stuff. He gets, I can communicate directly to voters, the press doesn't matter in quite the same ways. He doesn't get the mechanics of doing that the way Trump does, or the way, say, Al Sharpton did, and still does. But he has that instinct. He sees where the center of gravity is going in New York, and he sees it too soon, and he wants to capitalize on that. But what I do think is the shock of Trump and the recognition of how much less stable our politics are than they seem has a lot of decent people thinking about how to participate in their own lives, their own governance, and their own communities through our current political system or otherwise. And that does give me some hope for a moment of, not a moment, for a sustained period of like reform and the really boring work of like building foundations and systems that work over time and are actually in the interests of most of the people who are there, instead of a politics in which the handful of people who are really directly staked in what's happening are effectively electing their own bosses in government, and no one else is paying any mind generally until that hits some sort of crisis point. So it's a suppressed conversation right up until it's, oh God, is Illinois going to go bankrupt? What happens to all these pension promises we've made and that people have based their lives on for a really long period of time? You go decades without asking those questions and using phony accounting methods so that things seem okay. And I'm hopeful we might be at the starting point of a better conversation going forward, but not, to be frank, that hopeful.
Well, and I think one area where we clearly agree is that the media ain't what it used to be. I mean, I've been doing it a long time, as you can see from there. But when I was a young kid growing up the New York Times, we had to learn all of, say, for example, the city bonds, RAMs, TAMs, and what did all these words mean? And it was because I think in most, the Times was not alone, papers had beats. They had beat reporters who specialized in covering the fire department or the police department or the budgets or housing or health. Most papers don't have that anymore. They have a bunch of reporters who run around every day chasing the fire of the day. And whether that's a murder, a court case, an actual fire, a sex scandal. So you have a bunch of what we call just basically general assignment reporters waiting to be told what to do that day. They have no expertise. Again, when I started in New York Times as a full reporter, I started in 1972 right out of college, but as a full reporter in 1978, my first beat was housing. And I had to learn the difference between rent control and rent stabilization. I had to go to the courts and watch housing cases. This is before I wrote a word. I mean, that was the way you were expected, so that when you began to write, you would know what you were talking about. I mean, what a novel idea. So I think there's a kind of darkness that is now happening because the media is not smart, and therefore the public is not smart. Then, of course, the whole other issue of the public turning away from the establishment media by and large, getting their news elsewhere. But I do think there is for lack of term, a rising tide of ignorance on both sides of these issues, and the boodlers and the scammers and the opportunists take advantage of that ignorance to their own benefit. And just quickly, I would say, I think a lot of them don't know what they're doing either. I think a lot of the people in government have no idea what goes on, what these words mean, what powers they have, what powers they don't have, where these powers come from. They've never read a judicial decision. They've never watched a court. I mean, it is really the blind leading the blind.
I want to turn it over to you guys in a second, but I just want to a few points that help elucidate what we just heard. One of them is that DiBlasio is fine because the stock market is at 2,300. I mean, it's inconceivable. 23,000. Excuse me. You're right. I was just saying it's unimaginable. I can't imagine it. My God. So DiBlasio attacks the rich, blah blah blah, standard rhetoric, and he lives off of Wall Street. Second, part of the reason Giuliani doesn't build up and Bloomberg don't create an alternative structure, which Harry is talking about, is because the demography of the city changes. The people who elected Giuliani are either passed on to their reward or living in Florida, which may be the same thing. But this is a very different city, and what Bloomberg did, he engaged in an unleveraged buyout of the city's civic life. So he emptied the city out of any cultural civic content. And finally, I think though it pains me to say this, I have to agree with Harry that the public sector unions run the city. They're the people the only people who will come out on election day. I talk to friends I have a porch in Brooklyn, and I sit on my porch, and people come by and they talk to me, and the only people who are going to vote in this mayoral election, so far as I can see, are people who work for the public sector. Everyone else is yawning. They think I'm a complete bore when I mention it. Why do we want to talk about this? Let's talk about Trump. Fair enough. Let me stop there. Oh my God, your hand's up already, Freddie? Go ahead. Go take the first question.
I don't think it's quite accurate that we didn't discuss the problems. I think what we're trying to do is take an overview as to why the problems exist. I don't think we need to tell you that there's a homeless problem. I think you know that.
The fact that there is no people voting doesn't make for homelessness.
Well, I think there is a direct connection that because people don't vote, because we don't have a functioning democracy, these problems aren't addressed. Now, I would say that Giuliani and crime was an instance where the election addressed the specifically largest problem the city faced, as the city saw itself. We can all have different opinions as to what the problems are, but I think that was an issue. Go back to Abe Beame and his defeat. Again, the city body, politics, saw the financial crisis and the impacts of it as the problem, and it addressed it with the person it thought would be best to fix that problem, Ed Koch. So the point being that both Dinkins and Beame, whether we inherited them or created them or both, were defeated because the city body came together in large turnout elections to solve the problem. I think that's the clear history of modern New York.
And they solved education problems.
Well, we don't agree with the problem is, for starters, right? So you have crime as separate from homelessness, for instance, and homelessness plays into street homelessness in particular, fears about crime. And homelessness generally interferes about displacement and the rent being too high and all the rest of it. But crime is very broadly distributed. And cities handle this in different ways. New York's handled this very honorably and policed the whole city for a very long time now. Whereas Chicago is like, do your crime over there. And that's been the political accommodation. But generally, all these things are chronic conditions, and there's sort of a presumption that there's some level in which they're going to occur. The homeless condition being at a higher level in New York is there's a right to shelter that doesn't exist otherwise. Again, that is separate from the street homeless, which are actually a very different population and set of issues. But most of this isn't entirely solvable. So politically, it's you can manage things, and someone is always going to be bothered, and then does this present or suggest a larger issue? And often the things we pretend are those issues, squeegee men, for instance, are almost unrelated to the underlying concern. So disrepair and a sense of chaos and a lack of safety, and people not wanting to stay and invest in the city is one thing. That you're going to have like some people out who are chronically getting rearrested for small stuff, who have other issues, is another. And you can always find some squeegee guy in any of these areas. In the middle of Giuliani's epic reforms, right when DiBlasio's there, you find a guy who has 117 arrests. Well, guess what? 83 of them just happened under the last law and order mayor, right? That's chronic. Broadly, Freddie, most of this is outside the mayor's control. Things are going to be more unaffordable because the market's doing so well, and the world's capital is coming here. It's competing with like us human beings for money and limited shelter, and nobody's willing to say, tear up the zoning and like build a much bigger, denser city that people can actually afford to live in. So that really is past what this guy can do. So he tries to manage that problem and treat the condition. If he doesn't do enough, voters get very angry. And at that point, new people do turn out, and it upends our politics, especially in this era of rapidization. But right now, we're not there, and we have, just this slow-moving blood that's circulating and circulating. No one's having a panic attack or a heart attack or anything else, and so we're just sort of on a pause. And finally, with the schools, look, if you're the mayor and you're thinking mostly about teachers who vote and think a lot about this and about all the functions the system serves, you've done this pre-K thing, right? Which has complicated politics and doesn't get the tax hike, but he does get the money, right? The system isn't just to educate kids, and it's doing that give-take about as well as it has, which is never great, and you can figure out the different factors that go into that. The system's every bit as segregated as when this mayor got there, and he's completely avoided that issue, and spoke very dishonestly about it in the last debate. But, it's functioning. Teachers are getting paid, parents have a place to put their children so that they can go to work and do stuff, and there's some sense that they're going to advance. It becomes a chronic condition, at least for the time being, and that makes it harder to isolate any issue. And Nicole Maliotakis and Idiot Bodito are trying, but she's a lightweight, he's a lowlife and a moron, and it means that no one is pressing this debate. So given my druthers, we have this con that nobody in organized power in either party wants, and seems like a fairly sensible idea to me.
Explain what that is.
It's a constitutional convention that our stupid constitution that nobody respects or takes seriously, that bans gambling, but we have casinos and blah, 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 changes all the time, calls for it. We can vote to have every 20 years. And then representatives get put in who could just be the same power brokers, or could be lunatics, or could be somewhere in between these delegates, and they can amend the state constitution. There's lots of ways this can go wrong, but given how badly things are going, and predictably, it seems to me like let's take a shot with this magic bullet. And voters then have to approve any changes, right? So it's not like the Koch brothers, as many people in labor here are warning now, can like sneak in and destroy New York. So, look, what I'd like to see is an end to our weird fusion system in which people can run on multiple lines. I'd like to see an end to our bullshit registration system, to our bad registration system. I'm sorry to everyone, and especially my parents. To our bad registration system that is meant to lock people and candidates out of running for office, and something that actually functions like an accountable participatory democracy, where people don't constantly suddenly retire so they can gift their seat to someone else, or have party bosses do so, where the reasonable incentives for people to run, and at that point, we can take the Albany bums and start actually paying them decently, and not doing it again through travel per diems and other set-asides. And Lulu's that give
What's a Lulu?
The base salary is very low. Lots of the money comes in side pots, and there's ways that individual members can gain that, and that their leaders can gain that to maintain control and power. And you know, it is a very plain and obvious incentive to bad behavior. But if you want to get rid of those, you need some sort of system in which these people are actually accountable to voters, and that means opening things up. You know, that would be the path I see to get in.
I'm less persuaded that, I mean, that seems like a long way around to get to what we really need are people to vote. I mean, if there are roughly 300,000 city workers. Well, let's say almost all of them belong to one union or another. A number of retirees, although not that many necessarily living in the 5 boroughs and therefore can vote. The problem is if more people saw that and the reason the unions vote, of course, is they see they have a direct stake in the winner. Why doesn't everybody see that? Because it's true. So that to me befuddles me, why people, ordinary citizens who work for a living or who, whatever they do, or retire, why do they not see their own stake in voting? I mean, that's the whole purpose of voting, is for your stake. And to me, it is what undercuts democracy, which is why I put low voter turnout as the most significant issue we face in this city and state. Well, look, I agree with you. I did mention education in terms of the outcomes, that being, we have the highest per capita costs and some of the lowest outcomes. And I think this is one of the reasons, is that other things have gotten in the way of education. And this mayor has actually gone further backwards on that issue of discipline by basically taking away the power to suspend from principals and teachers too. So I think that one of the areas where the union has actually bucked the mayor, and this union and this mayor, over the issue of suspensions. I mean, it is clearly one kid can ruin a class for 30 kids and there are no consequences.
That's been an issue. I don't think it's where you would start. Either if you're looking to improve educational results, or if you're keyed in particularly on the segregation question, which is just an implicit sob to homeowners and affluent New Yorkers, so they stay here and keep paying taxes, is based on where they live, they're going to be protected from those kids and those schools, as you more or less put it. The thing is that separation, combined with charters replacing Catholic schools, which had more decent and generous policies for who they would admit, means you end up with not just like rowdy students with knives running the joint, but everyone with learning disabilities, emotional needs, or parents who are checked out, all clustered together in the same schools, whereas the people who are going to produce measurable performance all exit the system. And that creates an obvious and draining spiral that the last mayor and this mayor, for different reasons, I think were both disinterested in doing anything about, but strikes me as indecent. And then a lot of this gets hidden behind a bunch of nonsense STEM talk and like Silicon Valley happiness about how it's a question of the skills we're teaching and how those don't match up with the future workforce, which isn't wrong, but is deeply cynical and a distraction from much more substantial issues, especially because everyone isn't going to be a brilliant knowledge worker. And educating and having those kids in decent environments is very important and much easier to ignore.
Could I just say one quick thing about Harry's reference to charter schools? I couldn't disagree more. I think it is a moral imperative to save every child you can. And if charter schools can save 100,000 kids or 50,000 kids, I think that's wonderful. And I think they ought to be celebrated rather than demonized.
Can I jump in there for just 1 second? I have complicated feelings about charter schools. I'm certainly not trying to demonize them. And measuring costs and benefits has been nearly impossible on every side of this debate, because the people who are the most vested in it functionally want one system or the other, and they're in competition. There are very obvious gains, and they do tremendous good to students who would otherwise be stuck in some very bad schools. How that measures against often the harm done to students left behind, who are the ones without motivated parents, and how this is changing actually just the makeup of many public school classes in terms of needing second teachers there, having special needs students, and so on, is complicated. I actually think the tension between the charters and the public system, and the tension within the public system, by the way, between administrators, who have lost a lot of power under this mayor, which I think is a negative, and teachers, are in many ways healthy tensions that point to the give and take that every parent knows inherently between wanting what's best for your kid and wanting what's best for this system that you're part of and that you want to sustain and for all the other kids who are in it and around you.
Briefly, before we go to the next question, I think people only now are realizing how important Catholic schools were for the education of New Yorkers, and that the decline of Catholic schools, because they served a broad constituency, is irreplaceable.
Yeah.
To me, it befuddles me because it's self-obvious why people should vote. The people don't vote. To me, it's beyond understanding.
But voting's miserable here. It's registering to vote is miserable, and you have to do it way in advance. The way voting stations are set up is not great. If you want to run or participate, it's really interesting if you get in, but like just working out how I get in, or where these meetings are, or what's happening, or what the governing bodies are, is difficult. And all this is purposeful, and it's why everyone is against the con. Is look, if you're in on this now, and you're collecting a check, or you have a check to distribute in addition to that, it's like, why mess with the good thing? And new people coming in just hamper. So you have these groups that you know are going to come out. Orthodox Jews are another one, right? Who DiBlasio has a long relationship with, going back to his time on the council. And this is like a reliable block of votes from people who want specific services from the city. And often, by the way, education money that doesn't end up going into the public schools. So you know what those groups are. You know basically what they need. You deal with that and you're set. And anyone else coming out or participating is just going to mess with your thing. And in the absence of any accountability, if you're one of the lawmakers, why would you possibly make it? Like, this is working for you.
I mean, if I could just quickly, you're right. I mean, I would say all those things about why it's difficult to vote in New York are basically true. But let's look around the world. I mean, look at people die to vote now. I mean, they go and vote and they get blown up in a ballot box. I mean, we have it. These are first world problems.
Yes.
You know that the line is long, right? But I mean, it doesn't answer it for me. We could make it. I think actually voting here is pretty easy. I mean, changing parties is ridiculously difficult, but the actual voting process is pretty easy. So I don't think that's a legitimate hurdle for people who if you see your interest at stake, these are not hurdles. It's those who somehow don't see their interest. All of this becomes unbearable. I don't get it. Yeah, I mean, I think what you seems to be suggesting is a single-payer national system where the government essentially taxes everybody and then distributes health care. I think we may be going down that road eventually. I hope not. I mean, the experiences that I see in Great Britain and Canada and elsewhere, and they have very homogeneous populations compared to ours. It's not been good. And so I think if we go down that road, you have not seen chaos like you will see then, and gaming the system and different categories based not so much on income or wealth, but on connections. And so I think that is not an easy step politically or practically, and I don't think we're there. I don't think we're close to it yet, but I could be wrong.
I have no idea what we should do. What I will note is one of the places where Donald Trump has resonated is in his open disgust for insurers. And insurers are basically everyone should hate insurers. They're the house. The house always wins. You have to bet against your own interests. Like, you know, this is why James Cain novels are about insurance. Maybe it's the best of all possible worlds, but it's necessarily a frustrating and draining one. And Trump politically is right to say, look, my own party wants to protect the insurers as an attack. That speaks to more voters than not. The weird thing is, you have this big push in the Democratic Party for single payer, Bernie Sanders and other people saying that, and Trump, in this unlikely way, as a guy who just wants a win and really needs one in Washington, offering a lot of rhetoric that strangely aligns. We are in such an unbalanced place. I'm fascinated to see where these politics go. As to what we should do, or deductibility, or the rest of it, I couldn't say. The New York Post has been asking that. It's a great question. I mean,
Explain who Noah Deere is.
he's a former councilman who, was not recommended by the Bar Association, is nonetheless on the one bench, but then volunteers on another bench where he sees lots of cases involving members of the Orthodox Jewish community that he's long been a political part of.
Why don't the other judges complain?
Yeah. So I'd also point out Cy Vance, who's been the subject of the world's worst week of coverage, largely thanks to the New Yorker, is running completely unopposed. And we just, look, we have a judicial system that, even more than the others, and especially in Queens, but also in Brooklyn and throughout the city, is pseudo-democratic, pseudo-accountable, talking about very long 14-year terms. And, there's lots of good and honorable people who are part of it, but it lends itself to hacks. I love a 14-year commitment to a job, and I write about these courts. I know a lot of these people. Everything in New York is about past responsibility, right? So the MTA runs the trains, and the city owns the infrastructure. The governor runs it, because when the mayor ran everything, we were always going to have a nickel fare no matter what. And, it was political suicide to do otherwise, but now no one's accountable. Like, a huge problem in Albany is that we have a very large budget, approaching $100 billion, but then there's nearly as much more money off books and through the Port Authority and the MTA and dozens of other smaller authorities that have real power in these budgets that no one controls. So either you give them to politicians who have very short-term interests, and this goes to the judiciary as well, or you separate them out, and over time, either way, smart people find ways to game the system and control these pots of money. And when you don't have active and involved voters who are paying attention to understand this is in fact their money, it's really hard to get around this.
Doesn't the Democratic Party have a conscience at all? I mean, the people are supposed to run their own city, I would assume. If you believe that, why does the Democratic Party put people like Dia on the bench and allow him to pull this nonsense? Which is a disgrace. Everyone knows it.
No one has a conscience in politics. You say a bunch of stuff about individuals when you make group decisions with pots of money, and the conscience comes from voters and the press holding you accountable and calling this stuff out. So people have to operate decently and align what they say is in the global interest to some extent with that. Minus that accountability, none of that happens. So I mean, this is what Michael's saying. What's so damaging about not having people participate and having got out of the habit of that. It's like if you get real depressed and you stop showering or brushing your teeth, and then you try to do it once, but it's like, I'm still filthy. It's our politics right now. It's bad.
Is it corrupt?
Mike,
we alluded to that word before.
Oh, sure. Look, I think there are all kinds of corruption, and again, I think that I actually like a lot of politicians I've gotten to know over the years. I admire many of them, more chief executives than legislators, but I think they all respond to incentives. And years ago, I was writing about Giuliani when he was mayor, and it was a period early in his second term, this is before 9/11, where he was just doing a bunch of stupid things. And I said to a good friend of his, a very good friend, lifelong friend, I said, when is he going to stop? And he said, when he feels the pain. And I think that's the answer. We have to make them feel the pain. And if they don't feel the pain, they assume everything is fine. So if you are quiet, then they think you agree. That's the assumption. Ed Koch used to write letters to newspapers all the time. Not every time his name was mentioned, but every time his name was mentioned unfavorably. right? And I once said to him, why do you bother? And he said, because if you don't write and complain, they assume you agree. Well, I would say the same thing applies to voters. If you don't complain, they assume you agree. Look, I think that's an excellent question, short and to the point. I would say there have been some fundamental changes. I think that the Tammany reference, legal graft, right? I think we have done a lot to focus on that. I think that the conflict of interest laws about people in government owning businesses and, Tweed and others, Plunkett, they were land speculators while they were in the government. So he would buy a plot of land thinking, they're going to build a railway or a street there. And if they did, bingo, he hit it rich. And he said, I see my opportunities and I took them. He knew what was coming. It's like insider trading, right? I think there's less of that.
What I'm saying, there may be less of that particular activity, but there's always exploitation of opportunities within the law, outside the law. That has been the pattern.
It's a chronic condition. And so the exploiters aren't the political bosses, but you set up the Highline and your friends in real estate, and my boss Barry Diller and lots of other people have the buildings there already. And that's where the money flows. That's how this works. It's how it works with DiBlasio and his friends. The friends outside of government take the profits, and the government is not being personally corrupt, it's being corrupt for power. Human nature doesn't change. These are chronic conditions. If you hold government accountable, you can make things, you can shape them and improve them and limit how bad that gets.
Well, could I just, one line, just that's the point of democracy, though. Everybody is a faction. We're all factions. And when we all come together, we all compete, then it should come out, by and large, for the most good for the most people, the common good. That is the idea of democracy. But if we don't participate, it doesn't work.
With those words of wisdom, I mean that literally, let me thank you all for being here. I'm sorry we can't go on longer.